This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Neatsahone, and today I'm continuing with my Theros Beyond Death limited set review. Today we're looking at all the red cards in this set. I've already looked at the white, blue, and black cards in this set. We'll be looking at green tomorrow, multicolor the next day, and so on. In this video, I'm going to talk about every single red card in Theros Beyond Death and talk about how good I think it'll be in limited, which means either draft or sealed. I use a letter grade system to sort of sum up what I think about these cards after I talk about them. If you're unsure what those letter grades mean, you should find a guide to what those letter grades mean in the description below. Alright, let's look at our first card, which is the Accruing War, which for 3 generic and a red is a rare enchantment saga. Chapter 1 on this saga says gain control of target creature for as long as the Accruing War remains on the battlefield. So when you play this at the beginning, right when you play it, you get to steal an opponent's creature. And note, it doesn't last just until end of turn, like most of these effects do. Chapter 2 says until your next turn, creatures your opponents control attack each combat if able. You get the second and third chapters after your draw step on subsequent turns. The second chapter makes all of your opponent's creatures attack you if able. And then chapter 3 says each tapped creature deals damage to itself equal to its power. This is an interesting one and maybe a little hard to figure out without playing. 4 mana to steal a creature is great, but keep in mind that unlike most red effects like this, it doesn't give that creature haste. But again, the upside is it also doesn't last just for 1 turn. You'll have it for 2 turns instead. But this card does a whole lot more than just stealing a creature. It might take a little bit, but between stealing their creature, then forcing their creatures to attack you in the final chapter of their saga, you're going to be killing stuff most of the time when you play this. Overall, I think this seems pretty powerful. Chapter 1 gets a blocker out of the way, and then you can attack with it on the next turn. Chapter 2 forces your opponents to attack into bad attacks. And Chapter 3, most of your opponent's creatures will die who you didn't already sort of block effectively. Obviously, you get to avoid having your own creatures damage themselves since your creatures don't have to attack. Though I would recommend attacking the turn before Chapter 3 with the creature you stole so your opponent won't get it back. So yeah, like I said, this is hard to judge, but I think I'm pretty high on it here in the early going. I think this is a bomb. It just completely reshapes the game in your favor in most cases, giving it an A-. Next up we have Anax, Hardened in the Forge, which for 1 generic and 2 red is a star 3 legendary enchantment creature demigod at uncommon. Its power is equal to your devotion to red. Devotion is a mechanic returning from the original Theros block in this set. Your devotion to a particular color is equal to the number of that color's mana symbols on your cards. For example, Anax Hardened in the Forge, because it costs 1 generic and 2 red, adds 2 to your red devotion. It also says whenever Anax or another non-token creature you control dies, create a 1/1 red satyr creature token with this creature can't block. If the creature had power 4 or greater, create 2 of those tokens instead. Now this is a demigod. I've been a little disappointed with the first 3 demigods we looked at this week. They were all C+, which is pretty good, but not a lot more than that. Anax is definitely more, and might be the best one in the cycle. At worst, he's a 3 mana 2/3 with a nice ability that turns out creature tokens when stuff dies. Now, the fact that those tokens can't block is no joke. Part of the value of creature tokens is that they can provide chump blockers, and these can't do that. They're all about attacking. So, yes, this is definitely a downgrade, but still, you're getting creature tokens when stuff dies, and that's nice value. Plus, he also likes it when extra big creatures die because he can make you 2 tokens. It's nice, too, that this ability includes himself, so it's basically impossible for your opponent to straight up trade with Anax. He can even potentially get his power up to 4, in which case he would make 2 tokens. I think that Anax brings a lot of power for an uncommon, especially as a 3-drop, and he does enough to be first pickable in weaker packs, giving him a B-. Next up we have Arena Trickster, which for 3 generic and a red is a 3/3 human shaman at common, and it says whenever you cast your first spell during each opponent's turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Arena Trickster. A 4 mana 3/3 is pretty close to unplayable these days, but luckily for the Trickster, that isn't all that it has going on. Red, and especially red-blue, has several payoffs for playing stuff on your opponent's turn, and Arena Trickster is one of those, and he seems like he'll be a solid card in that type of deck. Even getting 1 counter on this is pretty nice, and anything beyond that, you start to feel really good about things. It also doesn't hurt that you make it bigger at instant speed, as sometimes that will really allow you to manufacture a blowout. Now, if you're in a deck with 0 or very few ways to pump him, you don't play him, but I think he will be a bread and butter type common for blue-red decks in this format. I'm giving him a C. Next up, we have Aspect of Manticore, which for 2 generic and a red is an enchantment aura at common. It's got flash, it's got enchant creature, and when it enters the battlefield, enchanted creature gains first strike until end of turn. Enchanted creature gets +2/+0. As we've seen so far this week, this set is loaded up with auras that are actually worth playing, and Aspect of Manticore is yet another one of those. Because of flash, it essentially functions as a combat trick at first, one that gives a creature +2/+0 in first strike, a power boost and keyword that means the creature you're putting it on is going to win a whole lot of combats. While the first strike doesn't stick around, the fact that this stays on the table and continues to enhance a creature will feel pretty good after it helps you kill something. It has a somewhat high mana cost, which does make it a little problematic to leave up sometimes, but I still think this seems like something that will make the cut in a lot of red decks, though I think I can also see myself cutting it a decent chunk of the time, so I'm going to give it a C-. Next up, it's Blood Aspirant. For 1 generic and a red, it's a 1/1 Satyr Berserker at uncommon, and whenever you sacrifice a permanent, you put a +1/+1 counter on Blood Aspirant. He also has an activated ability where you can pay 1 generic and a red, sacrifice a creature or enchantment, and it deals 1 damage to target creature. That creature can't block this turn. This guy obviously does awful on the vanilla test, as 2 mana 1/1s do, but he has some very interesting text. He gets bigger when you sacrifice permanents and also gives you a way to do that. His ability to ping a creature and make it unable to block is pretty powerful, especially because he will be getting bigger at the same time. He will often make your attacks look way better if you're willing to give up a creature or an enchantment. There will, of course, be times when you just can't get things going with the Aspirant, and that will hurt, but there will also be games where activating his ability twice will just win you the game, and he can just take games over for you. It's worth noting, too, that the black-red deck in general, as it often is interested in sacrificing, so he's probably going to be at his best there. I'm hesitant to say this gets into the lower B range, mostly because it does ask for you to have some sort of board state to really do his thing, and he's horrible on the vanilla test, so he won't always work out, but I'm going to start him at C+. Next up, we have Careless Celebrant, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/1 Satyr Shaman at uncommon. When it dies, it deals 2 damage to target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls. This is pretty great. A 2 mana 2/1 that is relevant all game long is always nice, and that's what we have here. You can set up 2-for-1s pretty easily with this, and that's the ideal situation, but even if you can't do that, you can just trade up with it, since it can take down anything with 4 toughness all on its own. Situations will be created where your opponent's attacks just won't work for them because of this 2-drop, and that's going to feel pretty good. I think you can first pick this in weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Dreamshaper Shaman, which for 5 generic and a red is a 5/4 enchantment creature. It's a Minotaur Shaman, and it's an uncommon, and it says, at the beginning of your end step, you may pay 2 generic and a red and sacrifice a non-land permanent. If you do, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-land permanent card. Put that card onto the battlefield and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So, as usual, let's start with the stats. 6 mana for a 5/4 is not good, but of course this guy has a huge block of text which allows you to sacrifice a permanent at each of your end steps. And then it does a typical red chaotic type effect. You get to put the top non-land card in your library onto the battlefield. Note, by the way, that he can sacrifice himself to the effect, and that might come up in some scenarios. Anyway, how good is this effect? I don't love it, mostly because of how random it is. Sure, you could get something awesome, but if you sacrifice a creature and pay 3 mana and get like a medium common out of the deal, that's not going to feel good. Remember, when thinking about whether or not you're getting a discount on something coming into play, you should be adding the converted mana cost of the permanent you sacrifice and the 3 mana, and that just means it will be hard to make this work. Now, there are times when it could, namely if your deck can make lots of creature tokens, or if it has creatures that have nice abilities that trigger when they die, or even creatures with escape. But still, I think it will be very difficult to come out ahead with this thing, and it just has such a high mana cost that I'm not interested in it too much. I think it's a D+. With the caveat that maybe, in some decks, it could perform a little bit better, especially those that are black-red sacrifice decks. I could see it maybe being better, but let's start it at a D+. Next up, we have Dreamstalker Manticore, which for 2 generic and a red is a 4/2 enchantment creature Manticore at uncommon, and it says whenever you cast your first spell during each opponent's turn, it deals 1 damage to any target. A 3 mana 4/2 is usually a C, and this does a lot more than that. It's a fun design for limited because it fits well into 2 different red archetypes. Red-green is all about 4 and more power, and he helps you get there. Meanwhile, blue-red is all about casting stuff on your opponent's turn, and he's a payoff for that. and he's a pretty awesome payoff for it. Being able to ping things anytime you trigger it. This means that you can pick off X1s, you can do damage to your opponent, or you can use it to help you finish off a creature that entered into combat and got damaged, or a creature that you're damaging with an instant speed burn spell. You get the picture. This Manticore can do a lot, and that, combined with the fact that the fail case is a pretty reasonable stat line, means that I'm interested in taking this early sometimes, giving it a B-. Next up we have Escape Velocity, which for 1 red mana is an uncommon aura. It's an enchant creature, and it says enchanted creature gets +1/+0 and has haste. It has Escape, which means you can pay a mana cost and exile some cards from your graveyard to cast it from your graveyard. In this case, its escape cost is 1 generic and a red, exile 2 other cards from your graveyard. This is an interesting one. I would not usually be in at all on an aura that was red for +1/+0 and haste, but I think this will actually be pretty reasonable. Why? Well, because it also comes with Escape, which enables you to get it back at a key moment to give something new haste, which means your creatures, in a way, if you're willing to pay the extra mana, can always have haste if you need them to. Escape also helps you avoid 2-for-1s, because even if your opponent kind of blows you out when you put this on a creature, or after you put this on a creature, you can just keep bringing it back for value all game long. And all of this is especially possible because it only needs to exile 2 cards to come back. All that said, I mean, I don't think this is amazing or anything, but I think it's a neat design for an aura, and it's yet another pretty solid aura for this format in a set that's all about enchantment, so it makes sense that so many auras in this set are way better than the ones we normally see. I think this is going to be a nice card to have in your aggressive red decks. More than 1 copy could end up maybe being a liability, but I think you should value that first copy reasonably high, giving it a C. Next up we have Fateful End, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon instant. It deals 3 damage to any target, and you scry 1. Well, it isn't Lightning Bolt, or even Lightning Strike, but that's okay. This is still premium removal. This is a strictly better Open Fire, and Open Fire was one of the best commons when we saw it. Now, granted, this is uncommon, but it is still 3 mana to do 3 to anything at instant speed with Scry 1 stapled to it. It can kill stuff in response to auras and tricks, and it can kill the majority of creatures you're going to see in this format, frequently trading up. Scry 1 might just seem like small value, and I guess it kind of is, but adding a little bit of card selection to a good removal spell is nice. As is usually the case with premium removal, I think you can first pick this in some weaker packs, and taking it early is always going to be a good idea. I'm giving it a B-. Next up we have Final Flare, which for 2 generic and a red is a common instant. As an additional cost to cast it, you have to sacrifice a creature or enchantment, and it deals 5 damage to target creature. Removal spells that make you sacrifice permanents aren't usually ideal because you 2-for-1 yourself from the start. However, if you really need removal, you could do worse than Final Flare. It at least gives you a choice between 2 types of permanents, meaning you're going to have a lot of options about which creature or enchantment to give up. It is also an instant, so using it in response to your opponent's removal helps you avoid the 2-for-1 problem, as you and your opponent both end up losing 2 cards in that exchange. It also does 5 damage reasonably efficiently, but it is pretty far from premium removal, since only in select scenarios do you not end up 2-for-1ing yourself. But, like I said, it is removal, and it's good enough that you'll play the first copy often enough for this to be a C. Next up we have Flummoxed Cyclops, which for 3 generic and a red is a 4/4 Cyclops at common. He's got reach, and whenever 2 or more creatures your opponents control attack, Flummoxed Cyclops can't block this combat. 4 mana 4/4s aren't easy to find in Limited, and this guy comes with a keyword on top of that in reach. Of course, he comes with a substantial downside, which all but makes the keyword ability irrelevant. All your opponent has to do is attack with their flyer and some other creatures, and this Cyclops will be, well, flummoxed and unable to do anything about it. Mostly, you're going to be wanting to turn him sideways, and he'll be pretty good at that. He'll be a nice aggressive 4-drop for mini decks. I'm giving him a C. Next up, we have Furious Rise, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon enchantment. It says at the beginning of your end step, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card until you exile another card with Furious Rise. This is a strong build around. If you're making this trigger happen on most turns, you're going to end up with some serious Outpost Siege-esque card advantage. I also really like that, unlike most versions of this impulsive draw effect, you actually get to hold on to the card for a little bit, at least until you exile another card with Furious Rise. This means that if you get one trigger out of it and then your 4-power creature dies, you can keep the card in exile, where it is effectively part of your hand until you think you might need it, instead of needing to use it on the spot. This is going to be at its best in red-green, where the whole archetype is about 4 more power, and there seem to be lots of commons and uncommons who are sized so they can trigger this. That said, I think it'll be hard to trigger this in just your run-of-the-mill deck in this format, and if you aren't getting cards out of it, it's a pretty big liability since it doesn't actually impact the board state. I think it is probably an F in your typical deck. However, if you end up in red-green and have lots of 4-power creatures, Furious Rise will likely be one of the best payoffs in your entire deck, at which point it's probably a B-. Because the floor is so terrible, I don't think I would advise taking this first to begin the format, but I know I'll be tempted because this is a serious value engine if you can build around it. Next up we have Hero of the Games, who for 2 generic and a red is a 3/2 human soldier at common, and whenever you cast a spell that targets him, creatures you control get +1/+0 until end of turn. So earlier in the week, we saw that white has 2 cards with hero in their name who essentially have the hero mechanic, and both of them increase the power of creatures when you targeted them with something. Well, there are 2 heroes in red too, and this is one of them. The stats aren't awesome here, but they are passable on a creature with some upside. Still, you have to really end up with a decent number of ways to target it to really take advantage of that upside. I think this is solid, but it may be the worst of the heroes in this set, giving it a C. Next, we have Heroes of the Revel, which for 4 generic and a red is a 4/4 satyr soldier at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 red satyr creature token with this creature can't block. And whenever you cast a spell that targets Heroes of the Revel, creatures you control get +1/+0 until end of turn. So 5 mana for a 4/4 and a 1/1 is a good deal. Like all the satyr tokens, this one can't block, which is kind of a bummer, but the additional text on the heroes make up for that. Unlike the other heroes we've seen, which don't help you with going wide, Heroes of the Revel both helps you go wide and is a payoff for it, which is pretty nice. Just making this trigger happen once or twice in a game is going to feel pretty good. I think this is a card you can take with a first pick in some weaker packs, giving it a B-. Next up we have Impending Doom, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon enchantment aura with enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +3/+3 and attacks each combat if able, and when enchanted creature dies, Impending Doom deals 3 damage to that creature's controller. This gives a very efficient stats boost to a creature. +3/+3 for 3 mana is some serious business, but it comes with some downsides. Your creature always has to attack, and when it dies, it's going to do 3 damage to you. Now, on the flip side, you could also put this on an opponent's creature and take advantage of those downsides, but more often than not, putting it on your guy will be better. I mean, if you are giving your opponent's creature +3/+3 and making it attack you, what are the chances that you can just chump block it and kill it? Not very good, and that's bad, especially because you'll be giving up Impending Doom and then 2 creatures who are blocking the creature, so you're really getting 3 for 1. So most of the time that's not a good plan. It doesn't hurt that Impending Doom can do that, but most of the time you want to put it on your own creatures because the downsides will be worth it, because your opponent will be faced with the same problem. You have a huge creature that they're not usually going to be able to block with just 1 creature. In an ideal world, you probably stick this on something with some nice keywords that make it really challenging to block, and it hits your opponent really hard. I think this is another decent aura, one you're going to play, especially in aggressive red decks, giving it a C. Next up, we have Incendiary Oracle, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 human shaman at common, and you can pay 1 generic and a red, and it gets +1/+0 until end of turn. And if a creature dealt damage by Incendiary Oracle would die this turn, exile it instead. So this is a strictly better Fathom Fleet Firebrand, and that was a card that really overperformed when we saw it. Granted, it was a different format, but I'm similarly high on Incendiary Oracle. A 2-mana 2/2 that can raise its power if you pump mana into it turns out to be pretty good because it can attack well early in the game, and in the later part of the game, it can threaten to trade for a lot of stuff. The exile clause here is pretty nice too. If your opponent has a creature with escape, they're going to be very frustrated about the situation. I think this is a nice 2-drop for red decks, but I don't think you want to first pick it or anything crazy like that, but it's probably one of the ideal 2-drops for aggressive red decks, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Infuriate, a card we've seen a lot. For 1 red mana, it's a common instant. It gives target creature +3/+2 until end of turn. This is a decent trick. It gives a big boost for only 1 mana, and it is enough for you to win most combats, and that's what you want from a trick. But it is a trick, and like all of them, it's situational and also risky, since you can get blown out by a whole bunch of stuff in response to it. That's why most tricks don't really get out of the C- C range, and I think this falls in the lower range as a C-. Next up, we have Erois's Blessing, which for 3 generic and a red is a common enchantment aura. It says enchant creature you control. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 4 damage to target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls, and enchanted creature gets +1/+1. I like this. A removal spell that happens to be an aura. 4 mana to do 4 to something isn't amazing at sorcery speed, but it's definitely quality removal. The fact that you also get to put it on a creature to give it +1/+1 is nice, but it also means it has a bit of a downside, and that's the fact that you can end up getting blown out in response. If your opponent kills your creature that you're trying to put this on, you not only don't get to kill something of theirs, you lose your creature and this enchantment. Still, being an enchantment also has certain advantages in this format, so it probably comes out as a wash. I think this is really close to being a B-, but the fact that it isn't amazingly efficient and the fact it asks you to take risks keeps it from being a card I think I want to take quite that early, but it is a C+. Next up, we have Irreverent Revelers, who for 2 generic and a red are a 2/2 satyr at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you have 2 choices. One of them is destroy an artifact, and the other is that it gains haste until end of turn. I really wish there were more artifacts in this set. If there were, this guy would be a lot more interesting. As is, though, they are few and far between. A 3 mana 2/2 with haste is a D at best, really, so I think in an ideal world, you only want to bring this out of your sideboard, and only against someone who has at least a couple of targets for it. I think this is a D if you're playing it in your main 40, and a C out of your sideboard. Next up, we have Nyxborn Brute, who for 3 generic and 2 red is a 7/3 enchantment creature, Cyclops at common. Here's the red card in the Nyxborn cycle of common vanilla enchantment creatures. This has some pretty impressive power for 5 mana, 7's a lot, but 3 toughness isn't so good. It's far too easy for your opponent to trade down with this. I think you end up playing this if you need a 5-drop really badly or you really want enchantment creatures, but other than that, I don't think you want to play this, giving it a D+. Next up, we have Omen of the Forge, which for 1 generic and a red is a common enchantment. It has flash, and when it enters the battlefield, it deals 2 damage to any target. You can pay 2 generic and a red to sacrifice Omen of the Forge to scry 2. The red Omen seems pretty nice and is probably the best in the cycle. 2 mana to do 2 to anything at instant speed is a solid card, if not quite premium. Adding some scry to the later game doesn't hurt either. Then this gets a little bonus for both being an enchantment and a card with flash, since there are decks in this format interested in both things. This is cheap enough too that killing 3 and 4 mana creatures who have 2 toughness with it will happen a decent chunk of the time. Sometimes you'll break even on it, but I think you'll trade up enough that this will feel really good. Still, there are a huge chunk of creatures that it can't kill, and I think that fact keeps it just below being something I want to first pick, giving it a C+. Next up, we have Oread of Mountain's Blaze, which for 1 generic and a red is a 1/3 enchantment creature nymph at common, and you can pay 2 generic and a red to discard a card, and then you draw a card. In other words, you rummage. So this seems alright. 2 mana 1/3s are semi-decent, and this one is an enchantment. So even without an activated ability, it would probably be a D. The activated ability that it has is nice, as rummaging can help you improve the quality of your draws in a hurry. It's also fine that she doesn't have to tap to do it, so if you have a ton of mana, it can really help you rip through cards. This format, of course, also has a graveyard theme, and the Oread can certainly help you load up your graveyard for escape. It's not anything special, but it seems like a solid playable for a lot of red decks. I'm giving it a C. Next up, we have Ox of Agonis, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a 4/2 Ox at Mythic Rare. When it enters the battlefield, you discard your hand, then draw 3 cards. It has Escape. You only pay 2 red mana here, but you exile 8 other cards from your graveyard, and when it escapes, it comes back with a +1/+1 counter. This is a cool card. 5 mana for a 4/2 that in most cases will be netting you at least a couple of cards is pretty sweet, and the fact that he helps stock up your graveyard so you can bring him back later with Escape is some nice internal synergy. This is the kind of card that doesn't have impressive stats, and it won't be your win condition exactly, but the amount of cards it nets you, especially if you manage to get it back with Escape later, is completely absurd, and will be enough to win you the game on card advantage frequently. I also like the high power because it means finding a way to trade with the creature itself isn't too hard. The one place where this might not feel great is if you're trying to hold on to some cards in your hand, but the good news is you can wait to cast this until it is as beneficial as possible. I think that when you take all of that together, you're talking about a card you first pick most of the time you see it, but I do think it falls just short of being a bomb. When I initially saw it, I thought it was definitely a bomb, but then I started thinking about how expensive it is in terms of cards in your graveyard to escape with it, as well as the fact that its stats on its own aren't anything incredible, but it's still pretty close to a bomb. I'm going to give it a B+. Next up, we have Phoenix of Ash, which for 1 generic and 2 red is a 2/2 Phoenix at rare. It's got flying and haste. You can pay 2 generic and a red to give it +2/+0 until end of turn. It has escape. In this case, you pay 2 generic and 2 red and exile 3 other cards from your graveyard. And when it escapes, it comes with a +1/+1 counter. So let's break this down. A 3 mana 2/2 with flying and haste is already a C+ and maybe a B-. Then the Phoenix comes with the ability to pump its power if you pump mana into it, which means even if your opponent manages to get something with reach or flying into play, the Phoenix can take it down if it needs to. Then, like all Phoenixes, Ash Phoenix can rise from the ashes, and in this case it comes back as a 3/3. It also asks for only 3 cards to be exiled to escape, and because of that, escaping with this over and over again isn't far-fetched. This means this Phoenix is going to be a nightmare for opponents, constantly coming back and dealing lots of damage in the sky. While this Phoenix is small, I think that its recursion and efficiency are enough to make it into a bomb. A reasonably sized evasive creature who can hit hard and won't stay dead sounds like a bomb to me. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, we have Portent of Betrayal, which for 3 generic and a red is a common sorcery, and it says gain control of target creature until end of turn. Untap that creature, it gains haste until end of turn. Scry 1. They keep printing these effects, and they keep being pretty unimpressive. They're too situational most of the time. Stealing your opponent's creature is frequently not relevant. Granted, when it is relevant, it can be a pretty powerful effect, but I'm usually out on a card that is this narrow, because you're not going to be able to do anything with it more often than you'll actually be able to do something with it. There is one exception to all that, though, and that is if you have some sacrifice outlets. If you can steal your opponent's creature and sacrifice it for value, you're in business. It increases the percentage of the time that Portent of Betrayal will be relevant if you can do that. Still, based on experience and lots of other formats where these cards would be good with sacrifice effects, you still won't see it come together that often, even though Black-Red Sacrifice is a theme, and I don't think I can go above a D here as a result. Next up, it's Perforos, the Bronze-Blooded, who for 4 generic and a red is a 7/6 legendary enchantment creature god at Mythic Rare. He's indestructible. As long as your devotion to red is less than 5, he's not a creature. Your other creatures have haste, and he has an activated ability where you can pay 2 generic and a red to put a red creature card or an artifact creature card from your hand onto the battlefield, sacrifice it at the beginning of the next instep. Like all the gods, this is strong, but I think it might be the weakest of this cycle. The best ones are the ones that have a nice baseline, even if you never manage to get devotion high enough, and I think Perforos falls short there. Haste to your whole team is nice, as is his sneak attack ability, but sneak attack type effects really aren't that great and limited. It isn't like you're going to have Emrakul in your hand, you know? And having to give up that creature, even if you're getting it into play at a discount and sure it has haste, having to sacrifice that creature sometimes won't be very good. He does become huge and indestructible when you get your devotion high enough, and that's awesome, but I think his somewhat lackluster other abilities keep him pretty far from being a bomb. He's still good, don't get me wrong, and you'll almost always first pick him, but honestly, I think there are some premium removal spells in this format that I would take over it. I'm giving him a B. Next up, we have Perforos' Intervention, which for X and a red is a rare sorcery. Like all of the interventions, it's a modal card. You choose one. First option is you can create an X1 red elemental creature token with trample and haste, sacrifice it at the beginning of the next instep. And the second option is it deals twice X damage to target creature or planeswalker. This is really good. I think even better than Perforos himself. This either gives you a flexible and very efficient removal spell or a hasty elemental token. I think more often than not, you want the removal option here. It isn't the most efficient thing at only 2 mana, since it only does 2, but that's the least efficient it is. At 3 mana, you're doing 4 damage, and at 4 mana, you're doing 6, etc. This will be capable of taking down almost anything, and it does it at a discount. The other mode isn't as attractive in most cases, but sometimes your opponent's shields will be down, and making the elemental token to do direct damage to your opponent will win you the game. The X damage part doesn't let you hit players, but if that's what you're interested in doing, the elemental token can help with that. I think that between the impressive efficiency of the damage part and the useful mode of making an elemental token makes this a pretty easy first pick, and I think in the lower range of being a bomb, giving it an A-. Next up, we have Satyr's Cunning, which for 1 red mana is a common sorcery, and it says create a 1/1 red satyr creature token with this creature can't block. It has escape. In this case, you can pay 2 generic and a black, and exile 2 other cards from your graveyard to cast it from your graveyard. 1 mana for a 1/1 token that can't block would be an F. It just isn't worth the card. However, the fact that this can be cast multiple times throughout the game certainly improves that grade. It only asks for 2 cards to be cast from the graveyard, which isn't too crazy. However, I imagine in this format that I'm going to want to preserve cards in my graveyard for more impactful escapes than this. Getting more and more 1/1 tokens that can't block for 3 mana at a time doesn't exactly seem great to me, even if you have some sacrifice outlets and go wide payoffs. It does give you a place to sink your mana if you're flooding out, and that certainly doesn't hurt. And sometimes you'll be able to cast it multiple times in one turn, but again, because those tokens can't block, the fact that this is a mana sink that gets you creatures in play is going to be less good than usual. I honestly don't think you want to play this most of the time. I'm giving it a D. Next up, we have Skophos Maze Warden, who for 3 generic and a red is a 3/4 Minotaur Warrior at uncommon. You can pay 1 generic and it gets +1/-1 until end of turn. And it says, whenever another creature becomes the target of an ability of a land you control named Labyrinth of Skophos, you may have Skophos Maze Warden fight that creature. Well, this is super flavorful. It's a 4 mana 3/4 that can raise its power while lowering its toughness, and that's probably a C+. That ability means it can trade with almost anything, and also that every time you attack with it, if your opponent doesn't block, they could be about to eat 6 damage. But the Guardian also comes with the very specific upside of making your Labyrinth of Skophos way better, since the Minotaur will now fight anything you target with it. Now, the Labyrinth is a rare and this is an uncommon, so the chances of getting them both together aren't really high, but it'll happen from time to time and it'll be really sweet. Because of that though, we do have to leave him at a C+ with the caveat that, yeah, maybe he moves up to a B- in a deck that actually has Labyrinth of Skophos. Next up we have Skophos War Leader, who for 4 generic and a red is a 4/5 Minotaur Warrior at common. You can pay red and sacrifice another creature or an enchantment and it gets +1/+0 and gains menace until end of turn. A 5 mana 4/5 is usually a D+ or C- these days, but this guy does come with a useful ability. It becomes a 5/5 menace if you're willing to sacrifice something, and that's something that's difficult to block effectively. I don't think you'll always want him, mostly because you're probably hoping you have a more serious threat at 5 drops than this, but I think he'll make the cut often enough that he's a C. Next up we have Storm Herald, which for 2 generic and a red is a 3/2 human shaman at rare. It's got haste, and when it enters the battlefield, you can return any number of aura cards from your graveyard to the battlefield attached to creatures you control. Exile those auras at the beginning of your next end step. If those auras would leave the battlefield, exile them instead of putting them anywhere else. So, where does a 3 mana 3/2 with haste usually rank? It's probably a C. Obviously, though, this comes with a potentially game-breaking into the battlefield trigger, since it lets you bring back auras that are in your graveyard for a turn. This format is loaded up with enchantments, and the idea of getting 1 aura into the graveyard for this to take advantage of it isn't super crazy to imagine, and if you can do that consistently, you're going to be getting a lot of value for only 3 mana, and probably adding a ton of damage to the board that can attack right away. So ideally, for this to be at its best, you have to both be running a few auras, and have some ways of loading up your graveyard, so you can, as consistently as possible, get back at least 1 aura with the Herald. I don't think the typical red deck in the format will be able to do that regularly enough for this to be amazing, but even if you're only doing it like 30% of the time, I think that's good enough for a C+. I do want to give this a build-around grade though, because the more often you can do that, the more powerful the card is. In an ideal deck for Storm Herald, it's probably a B, and there will definitely be times when someone slams this on the board, gets 2 auras back, and suddenly they can swing for lethal. I think because this has such a reasonable floor and a pretty high ceiling, you can take this as a first pick in some weaker packs. Next up, we have Storm's Wrath, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a rare sorcery that deals 4 damage to each creature and each planeswalker. Board sweeping effects like this are always kind of interesting and limited. As I said earlier in this week when we looked at Shatter the Sky, they are inherently powerful and they can do something that completely changes the game. The problem is there are plenty of board states where it hurts you more than it hurts your opponent. That said, I still usually value these type of cards pretty highly. If you take it early, you can keep it in mind as you build your deck, and you can also play around it when you know it's coming and your opponent can't. Still, the fact that a card like this isn't very good in a creature-heavy deck keeps it from being an A, but I think it's powerful enough to still be a B. Next up, we have Tectonic Giant, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a 3/4 elemental giant at rare. Whenever Tectonic Giant attacks or becomes a target of a spell an opponent controls, choose one. It can either do 3 damage to each opponent or exile the top 2 cards of your library. You then choose one of those. Until the end of your next turn, you can play the card you chose. I like this guy a lot. He reminds me of the Titan cycle Not the one that's in this set, but the one from one of the core sets back in the day, because, he's a giant and he does stuff when he attacks. Sure, he's smaller than those titans, but he comes with fairly decent stats as a 4-mana 3/4 and an ability that triggers every time he attacks. And his ability is nice. Sometimes you want the damage, especially if your opponent's life is in danger. He can hit for as much as 6 all on his own. Other times you want the shot to cast some extra cards if you're trying to pull back ahead. So you repeatedly can get a pretty powerful effect out of it. And that's going to be especially nice if you can put like auras on this guy, so he's very difficult to deal with. And even if your opponent kills your giant right away, you're going to get some value out of it, since it gives you one of those two choices when it becomes targeted by the opponent too. Now, I think this falls a little short of being a straight up bomb, because his lack of evasion or size will mean sometimes he just doesn't get to do his thing. But the fail case here is really good enough for a B+, meaning you'll be first picking this most of the time when you see it. Next up, we have Thrill of Possibility, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant, and it says as an additional cost to cast this spell, discard a card, draw 2 cards. We just saw this card and it was fine. In Eldraine, it helped enable the blue-red draw 2 deck, and in this format, it'll be extra good because of the blue-red instant speed deck, which likes to do stuff on the opponent's turn to get various triggers. Even outside of that deck, Thrill of Possibility is a decent inclusion because it helps you load up your graveyard while also helping you rip through your deck for something you might need, and both of those are things you want to be doing. That said, I do think it's probably the kind of card that's 23rd or 24th in your deck, which means it also gets cut a decent chunk of the time. I think that means it's a C-. Next up, it's the Triumph of Anax, which for 2 generic and a red is an enchantment saga at uncommon. The first 3 chapters all say until end of turn, target creature gains trample and gets +X+0, where X is the number of lore counters on the Triumph of Anax. Chapter 4 says target creature you control fights up to 1 target creature you don't control. I don't like this a whole lot. The first 3 chapters help make it so your creatures can attack harder and they gain trample. And if you play this on turn 3 and your opponent has an empty board, you'll start doing a ton of damage. But that's the kind of ability that normally won't scale that well as the game goes on, even with trample. Sure, if you have creatures who are challenging to block, it gets more interesting, but the boost to power and trample just isn't something I'm that interested in. You kind of have to have your opponent low on life for it to be worth doing. I feel like most aggro decks would rather just play a 3-mana creature than this. Now, the 4th chapter of the saga is the most interesting one since it gives you a fight effect, but there's a problem here. Your opponent knows it's coming, meaning they can play around it to some extent. It just takes so long for you to get to chapter 4, so your opponent can really wait until you decide to fight with a creature and then mess with your plans. So where am I on this card? I don't think I want to be playing it most of the time. Even in aggro decks, I'm giving it a D+. Next up, we have Underworld Breach, which for 1 generic and a red is a rare enchantment. It says each non-land card in your graveyard has escape. The escape cost is equal to the card's mana cost, plus exile 3 other cards from your graveyard. And it says at the beginning of your end step, sacrifice Underworld Breach. This is getting a lot of buzz for the Eternal formats, but it won't be that good in Limited most of the time. It seems like the setup will be tricky. You have to both have a lot of mana and a well-stocked graveyard for this to be worth it most of the time, because I think you'll need to be casting 2 things from your graveyard when you play it. If you're just getting 1 card back, you won't really be doing much, though if that 1 card is a bomb, that does make a difference. While I think this is a card that will be useful in the right decks, it won't be good in most red decks. So I think it needs a build-around grade, since it's a pretty serious way to get value out of your graveyard. But I think it's probably a D in your average red deck in this format, and maybe in Magical Christmas Land, maybe it could be a B in a deck that's really good at loading up the graveyard and producing a bunch of mana. Next up, we have Underworld Fires, which for 1 generic and a red is an uncommon sorcery, and it deals 1 damage to each creature and each planeswalker. If a permanent dealt damage this way would die this turn, exile it instead. It mostly seems to me like there are not enough X1s in this set for this to be remotely mainboardable. Sure, you can use it post-combat to finish off creatures and stuff, but hoping to set that up is often a pipe dream. This is probably a D- if you've got to put it in your main deck. There's probably enough X1s that maybe, running it if you desperately need a 23rd or 24th card, could be worse. But it's a decent sideboard card against someone who has lots of X1s where you consistently at least kill 1 thing with it and have the chance to kill more than that, and that's who you bring it in against. Against them, it's probably a C. Next up, we have Underworld Ragehound. He's 1 generic and a red for a 3/1 elemental hound at common, and he attacks each combat if able. He has escape. You can pay 3 generic and a red and exile 3 other cards from your graveyard. You cast it from your graveyard, and when he escapes, he gets a +1/+1 counter. 2 mana 3/1s are usually playable, though one that has to attack every single turn is a little less appealing, but that's probably what you want to do with a 2 mana 3/1 anyway. That would probably be a C- or so on its own. The escape mechanic gives it a huge boost though, and could potentially even help you turn this thing into a 2-for-1. Or even better if you can escape more than once. It comes back as a 4/2, something your opponent will be pretty inclined to block, and something that can attack reasonably well all game long. And also keep in mind, the turn you play it or get it back with escape, it can actually block, and a 4/2 is no joke as a blocker. Like we've seen with similar mechanics, even if the recursion here is somewhat inefficient, you're still getting 2 bodies with 1 card, at a minimum here, and that's always nice. This seems like a solid red common to me, probably something that will be the bread and butter in aggressive red decks in this format, but not something incredible. I'm giving it a C+. And our last red card is Wrap in Flames, which for 3 generic and a red is a common sorcery, and it deals 1 damage to each of up to 3 target creatures. Those creatures can't block this turn. This is a reprint and not a very exciting one. This is the kind of card that some red decks will like to have because it helps them punch through on an opponent who is stabilized at a low life total, but I think it's too situational. And situational cards are the bane of limited Magic. If a card can't always be cast for some sort of value, it's probably not worth it, and Wrap in Flames is definitely not something you can cast all the time when it actually does something. The board has to be just right for it to succeed. There will be too many situations where this can't do what you want. I do think it's an okay sideboard card, because if your opponent has a lot of X1s, you have a chance to actually kill a couple of things with it, at which point you're kind of in business. I'm going to say this is a D- as a main board card and a C- out of your sideboard. Well, those are all the red cards in Theros Beyond Death. Tomorrow we'll be talking about the green ones. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of this series, as well as Theros Beyond Death gameplay in the near future, don't forget to subscribe. And if you're looking for the rest of these videos, there should be a link to the playlist in the description below. Thanks for watching.